Joanna Macy, the great environmental activist and systems ecologist, said that when faced with planetary crisis, there are three stories we can tell ourselves. Business as usual, in which we tell ourselves that some degree of damage is necessary for human progress. The great unraveling, in which we tell ourselves that mass ecosystem destruction is inevitable. And the great turning, in which we tell ourselves that evolving the way we live is the only way forward, and that we're at the beginning of one of the great projects in human history. On this podcast, we talk to people who are writing that third story, with their own work and their own lives. Mission-driven leaders who are dedicated to social and environmental impact at this critical moment for our species. Welcome to The Turning Point. Today's guest is Nick Reinke, CEO of HabiTerre. Nick grew up on a farm and spent the first part of his career in crop insurance banking. Today, as CEO of HabiTerre, he sits at the intersection between farmers who are trying to shift to more regenerative practices, but trying to make the financial math work, and food producers on the other side who are trying to support better practices, but need to better understand what it is they're investing in. In this episode, we talk about the science and scale of carbon emissions in agriculture and the difficulty of quantifying those. But it really lands on a larger thread that affects the entire climate movement. The challenge of creating value that can be realized throughout complex economic chains and can incentivize everyone to get behind the planet-friendly practices that are so desperately needed in the global food system. Nick, having grown up on a farm and worked in banking, is a climate tech executive who can see the problem through the eyes of multiple stakeholders. And it's a point of view I think we all need to seriously consider. I hope you enjoy learning about it as much as I did. Nick Reinke, welcome to The Turning Point.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, as a consumer, I'm pretty educated at this point that when I drive my car, I'm burning carbon-based fuels and I'm putting greenhouse gases in the air. Everyone has a pretty good idea of that. But I don't think a lot of people, including myself, have a detailed understanding of how carbon emissions happen in agricultural settings. So can you start by giving us a little primer on that?
Yeah. I'll try and keep that as little a primer as possible. It is a very rich topic, with agriculture being responsible for anywhere from 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions here in the United States to 25 to 35% globally, depending on how you look at the footprint of ag. So you can imagine there's a lot that goes into that overall footprint. So it can be any variety of scopes. Some of the biggest drivers out there that people hear a lot about are things like beef production and methane from cattle. Burps, not farts. Fun fact. Everybody thinks cow farts. It's burps more so. It's the enteric fermentation. So that's a huge source of emissions. But then, manure management out of those big cattle operations. But the place that we operate in is really in like row crop agriculture. So soil management, crop efficiency and things like that. So the key sources of emissions that we focus on at HabiTerre are things like soil carbon. Are we gaining soil carbon? Are we losing soil carbon through our farm management practices? And then other things like, how are we managing fertilizer? Anything nitrogen fertilizer, nitrous oxide is a really intense greenhouse gas by volume. It's about 300 times more intense by volume as a greenhouse warming capacity than carbon dioxide, for example. So that's a really important one. And methane, similarly, much more intense from a greenhouse gas warming standpoint. Yeah, so, nitrous oxide and soil carbon are really the big ones. And the beauty of it is, like, the things that farmers do to be more sustainable financially, more efficient with their production systems, they're the same things that we would want to see happen from a climate standpoint. So there's this really beautiful thing in especially the world of soil carbon that's kind of unlike the vast majority of climate solutions, where it really, like, it's not hyperbole to say it is this win-win-win, that if you're better managing your soil health, you're putting more carbon in that soil, you're becoming more resilient to the effects of climate change, which would be extreme weather events, drought, and extreme rainfall. You have better water holding capacity, better resilience to drought and extreme rainfall, and you're tending to be more efficient with your resources on farm. You need less pest management with those more integrated systems, and you can be more efficient with your fertilizer, which makes you more profitable as well. More yield per unit of fertilizer is better for you, better for the planet. So we have a ton of opportunity there, but easier said than done to realize that. So that's my quick-ish take.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Nick. You used a term in there a couple times, soil carbon, and I'm wondering if we could double click on that for the listener. One, could you just give us a primer on like what is soil carbon? How would you define it for the average person who doesn't spend their evenings and weekends watching videos about soil health? And then could you also then, second part of the question, talk a little bit about soil specifically as a solution for climate, and the storage of greenhouse gases? Because I think a lot of people think about, well, we need to plant more trees to store carbon in the trees. But I don't know if a lot of people are aware that we can also store, a lot of greenhouse gases and carbon in the soil. So could you tell us what soil carbon is and then talk about why it's like a critical solution, kind of a crux in the whole climate crisis?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. You know, one thing I'd throw out to begin with is a lot of people use the terms dirt and soil interchangeably. And anybody in the soil and soil health community, you'll notice they get really fired up about that. It's not dirt. Well, dirt is the inorganic, that's the mineral component. Like dirt has no life, right? And soil is soil because it is full of life, both, past life and existing current life. So when we talk about soil carbon, we're all carbon-based life forms, right? Like it's just a carbon cycle that's happening here. Humans to plants to microbes and everything in between, all carbon-based. So that's the organic matter component of soil. If we're growing a crop, that crop grows, that crop dies, that organic matter goes somewhere, and we know that all gets broken down by the soil microbial community, all the bacteria and fungi and all the fun stuff that are living in healthy soil. And the healthier the soil, the more of that stuff there is. So the faster the cycle and the more carbon is active in that soil. And then there are a couple of components of soil carbon. There's the active, biological piece that's cycling in and out. The soil is essentially breathing. The soil is functionally the planet's version of breathing, and the plant matter on top of that is how the planet and how the soil breathes. And then the soil carbon piece is just your remainder. Are you putting more into the soil, or are you putting more into the atmosphere? And as far as soil as a climate solution, a couple fun facts on it. We talk about the living things in the soil. One fun fact that I've heard, and Google it, I'm directionally right on this, is a teaspoon of really healthy soil has more bugs, more creatures in it than there are humans on the face of the planet. Billions, right? It's just so cool. Like there's that much in there. Also kind of gross if you ever gotten a mouthful of soil when you biffed it outside. Like you've got a lot of living stuff in there. But also when you talk about it as a climate solution, atmosphere is this huge amount of gas floating around the planet. All this carbon dioxide is a huge part of it. There's twice as much carbon in the soil as there is in the atmosphere. And that is with largely globally depleted soils from really aggressive land management tactics. So there's huge opportunity to put a lot more back. Doubling the stocks in a lot of agricultural lands is absolutely feasible. And the beauty of it is it doesn't require new technology. We don't need to build direct air capture facilities, and all those things are absolutely wonderful solutions to climate. But all we got to do is just manage the land a little bit differently. Like the tools are already in existence, and we just need to understand how they work and how to incentivize them. So that's the other beauty of it is it happens at the speed that we can influence the change. There's no technological precursor that we need to invest in for the next number of decades. Like I'm not going to Mars here. We're just putting more plants on the ground and keeping them there longer. That's it. So you can tell I get fired up about it, but hopefully that answers the question. Yeah.
No, it's great. It's not talked about enough in the climate space outside of the ag sector, in my experience. So, but if we could again kind of double click on one of those things you're talking about, we don't necessarily need new technology, but in your precursor, you were also talking about, yield and how proper farm management or row crop management actually it can be a win-win-win. So could you talk a little bit about the trade-offs between sustainability in ag and then, productivity in ag and kind of how you see that? Because I wonder if some of the listeners might be thinking, well, in order to grow conventionally, we need all these inputs, and then that might be a net negative from a climate perspective. So could you just talk a little bit about the relationship between, sustainable or regenerative agriculture and then productivity?
Yeah. I'll try and parse that a little bit because lots of differing opinions on these terms and how they're defined and what it means to be sustainable or regenerative. So I'll just say I am not going to stick my neck out there and define regenerative for anybody. Like if we're making the planet better in the process of what we're doing, it's probably some form of regenerative in that mix, but nobody's really nailed a great definition on that. And sustainable, I think, is easier in some ways because it can be self-defining. Like, is what we're doing something that can sustainably continue to be done the way it's being done over the long term? Spoiler alert, most of what we're doing on this planet, that's a hard no. But to be sustainable, that's maybe an easier definition. So simple terms, maybe we just say regenerative, like you're improving by the act of the way that you're managing your land in this case. Regenerative would mean that you are improving the overall sort of environmental picture of the land that you're managing. Sustainable, you are sustaining. You're not gaining, you're not losing, but at least we're not going in that wrong direction where eventually you're not going to be able to farm that way in the future. And that also involves a financial component. A lot of the people that are, mission driven work in this. It's, well, we should do the right thing for the planet. Well, yeah, people need to make a living, and farmers are oftentimes very, very low margin operations where they can't afford to take on the risk even when they know and want to do that right thing. So that ties to your question on whether there's a trade-off or if it really is kind of that win-win. And the truth is, if we're talking about it as being sustainable in terms of using all the most modern technologies in agriculture and trying to run a sustainable operation financially and environmentally, what happens is if you make a transition from more conventional agricultural practices, more intensive tillage and things like that have been done historically to manage weeds and pests, to make that transition to something that is, low tillage, low ground disturbance, or no tillage, and using more integrated systems with like cover crops and things like that, there is a cost to changing machinery. There's a cost to planting cover crops that's not offset by a direct revenue piece. And then as you make that transition, there's the guys that I've heard talk about their transition to regen ag, they call it it's tuition. You're paying tuition, it's tuition fee to learn. Like, you're not going to figure out how to best manage this new crop production system in the first year. So there's a tuition fee of just learning how to do a good job of that new management system as a farmer. And on top of that, there is potentially some drag in yield as your soil health comes online, right? Your system needs to adjust to this new way of management, and the nutrients may not be there the way that they would be in the future once that soil health is improved. So there are different things like that. The jury's kind of out on whether or not there is a definitive yield penalty and how long that is, if there is one for transitioning practices. But that's probably the most costly or risky part for farmers, is to say, what I'm doing is working. I have very narrow margins. I can't afford to be the one that takes the risk unless somebody's sharing in this risk with me to make that transition. And the tough part is, depending on how it goes in that transition, the benefits show up anywhere from year 1 to year 10 to never. And most of it centers around like years 2 to 6 or so. But that kind of uncertainty is pretty hard to plan around if you're, again, lean margin and making financial decisions with your banker year to year. That's how it's going. It's a pretty tough proposition to your banker to say, hey, I know I'm just barely paying back my operating line right now, but you want to take a chance with me for the next couple of years where I'm probably going to lose money, and hopefully it works out. The system's it's just not built to work with that. But over the long term, it is proven beyond question that better soil health management practices, therefore, more regenerative practices, are more profitable and more resilient over the long term. So if you take that long-term lens, or if you're looking at it from a system scale standpoint, it is irrefutable that, regenerative ag practices are the future. But last thing I would want to mention there would be, one of the things that clouds the conversation on this, because it sounds so obviously good, Nick, like, why is this not happening? Well, part of it's finance, but so much of it is wrapped up in some form of identity politics around this stuff. It's like, you talk to somebody like, I try to eat whole foods as much as I can, more veggies and more raw meats and try to not eat the super processed stuff. Great. Or I'm a vegan. And then there's this whole other set of things that go along with that. Well, are you eating that way because of your belief around, how animals are managed in today's society? Or are you eating that way for your own health and the planetary health and what's driving that? So when you start to talk about sustainability, I mean, are we saying non-GMO, no artificial tools, chemicals, adjustments, anything like that? Well, if that's what we're talking about, then there is a huge cost in terms of productivity and profitability because that is taking a major step backwards in terms of the evolution of technology in agriculture. And I won't claim to have an opinion, good or bad. It's just like, let's be honest about the trade-off, that if everybody went pure, non-GMO, organic, regenerative, we're going to have a feeding the planet problem immediately, because we're not going to be producing at the same level. And that's a really nuanced debate that we're probably not getting into here. But that's where I say, like, in simplest terms, if we're just thinking about what's our environmental impact, and let's look at the most material components and maybe try to stay away from the, how we feel about it, like what's the actual objective outcome here. And that's, again, the business that we're in is trying to just create objective outcome quantification to be able to enable these incentives, these mechanisms for the adoption of those practices, and trying to remove the subjectivity from it as much as possible, which, as humans, it's impossible to remove subjectivity entirely, but we try.
Yeah, I appreciate the light that you're shedding on the nuance of the conversation, because it is really complex. The dynamics around the seam is equally complex as soil health. And if we could narrow in on one slice of the pie, it seems to me that one of the mechanisms to try and address this is carbon markets in agriculture. So, are carbon markets an ecosystem saver? Are they totally baloney? And how do they impact the agriculture sector and the work of farmers?
So I will keep my answer specific to the world of agriculture, because that's my expertise. So carbon markets writ large, broadly, you don't need to do a lot of research to say that it's a spectrum. Some aspects of carbon markets are really, really impactful. Others are a bit of a shell game that did we actually, accomplish or improve anything, right? So that's broad comment on carbon markets, is they can work really well as a tool, and they can be just a way to tell the story that you want to tell without actually driving any meaningful positive impact. In its own way, that has some truth in agriculture as well. It can be challenging to generate this thing that we call a carbon credit, which is basically we're saying that because you paid for this thing, something changed that either pulled 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent out of the atmosphere or prevented 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent from being emitted. So then all of these people do all these project designs and, documentation and methodologies to say, here's why we believe it's valid for us to say that you buying that $20 carbon credit is the reason that that ton of carbon didn't make it into the atmosphere, right? And so then the idea behind carbon markets is that you're creating this unit that can be bought by anybody. It can be bought by a technology company or an oil company or whoever that may have no relationship to agriculture whatsoever, because we've created this fungible, tradable unit of a thing that we all supposedly agree means the same thing, whether it came from ag carbon or direct air capture. Let's see the smirks that probably already understand where I'm going with this. It doesn't mean the same thing. Like carbon credits, it's impossible to have them all be created equal, and I would argue that we shouldn't try, because there are major co-benefits that go along with carbon credits in agriculture. So great, you like all the things we already talked about on improving soil health and all the benefits that has. We didn't even talk about the nutritional benefits. The better your soil nutrition is, the better your human food nutrition is. Like, it's so many great things about it. And then let's contrast that with, I don't know, direct air capture is just a favorite example of mine, because it's a purely engineered solution that has no reason for existing other than climate impact. And depending on how you think about climate and carbon, you could make a really strong argument for either one being a far better solution, right? So the way that the markets value carbon credits today, direct air capture is actually probably a far better solution for a carbon credit transaction, because you know for sure that that thing wouldn't exist if you weren't buying carbon credits. And the way that it stores carbon is as permanent as anything out there. Like it is stored and it's gone, and it will stay gone. And in agriculture, the things that you're looking for, proof that what you paid for is the reason that it changed. Like farmers are making 100 different decisions on a piece of land any given year. Your $20 didn't meaningfully change that. Sorry. And it's a carbon cycle. It's dynamic. So there's carbon just flowing in and out of the system. It's a breathing system. So can I say that that ton that you bought stayed in that acre now until forever? Absolutely not. It's silly that we even pretend that that's the case. So can we use carbon markets to directionally influence? Are we gaining soil carbon over time? Great. But the way that carbon credits and carbon markets work broadly just does not map well to agriculture. So either we need to rethink the way that we're structuring it in agriculture, or the future that we see and that we're really excited about at HabiTerre is the supply chain side. So now you're connecting the actual practices on farm with the actual commodity that goes into an actual product that is marketed by a company. And it is what it is. There were environmental impacts created by that product that you made. And if you want to reduce or improve the environmental impacts of that product, then it kind of has to happen within the things that went into the product, right? So now you're making it a much more real story, and maybe we don't have to be so attached to whether or not that ton of carbon went away for forever because we didn't transact it outside of your supply chain. You're still sourcing from the same areas. So ultimately, you want your farmers and your supply chain to be more resilient. These practices make them more resilient. You're de-risking your business. You get to tell the story of how you're investing and improving your actual footprint that you're responsible for as a corporate. And it's an incentive that starts to make a lot more sense to farmers because they're used to selling commodities. They're not used to selling carbon. So carbon doesn't make a whole lot of sense to them, but a commodity that is value added because of the data story that goes along with it, that makes a lot of sense. Farmers are used to selling commodities at premiums or discounts all the time. That's the nature of selling commodities. So that's a future I think we get really excited about, is like, let's attach the environmental attributes to that commodity or to that sourcing region or footprint and start to just have that story be more connected to the reality of business operations. And maybe we don't need to spend so much time and effort and money on derivative creation of new asset classes. And maybe we can just kind of simplify the whole thing in a way that is more relatable and more tangible for this totally intangible good.
Yeah. So earlier, Nick, you mentioned the problem of the cost of the transition, right? And you were saying the problem is there might not be a way to share that risk. So is this what you're getting at, that there are better ways to share that risk? And so can you maybe give a specific example of how a producer might be mitigating that risk by doing some of the things you're talking about?
Yeah, for sure. One of the main groups that's funding improvements in practices in agriculture would be CPGs, consumer packaged goods companies. So you're like food and beverage companies, the big brands that everybody recognizes one way or another on the shelves. They're investing a lot of money in it. And even so, like, they can't afford to invest at the level that it would take to fully de-risk and offset the risk and cost of practice transition for farmers. And even in spite of that, a lot of farmers are making that change because they know the benefit of it on the other side. So even a shared risk model with just one funding source is gaining traction, right? So sure, is my cost of transition potential risk, let's say it's $50 an acre to get a cover crop in there and a little bit of yield penalty or whatever, and that's the first couple of years. And I think by year 3 or 4, I'll largely offset that with production efficiencies. Well, if I get to sign up a program that's a 3 to 5 year program or whatever it is, and I'm getting $15 an acre is a more realistic payment as to what's out there today with a single funding source. That's enough to get some guys off the fence. It's like, I've been wanting to do this. That's enough of a nudge. I'll do it. But where it really, really starts to sing, I think, is when you're able to start thinking about, can we stack programs and sources of funding? So we've got, government funding that's been around for forever to fund sort of trials of these practices, which can be a great catalyst. But the reality we see with government funding is you get this good 3 years of a pretty significant per acre investment. But then by statute, it's only for 3 years and you can't re-up. So now at the end of 3 years, if you didn't quite make it work inside of that 3 years, or you thought it's kind of a headache to go and plant an extra thing, and I don't have any reason to keep doing it, I didn't see the benefits on that timeline. The general numbers on it are about half of all the acres that got that kind of investment go right back to conventional practices when that investment falls off. So like, credit to, USDA, NRCS, the folks that have been running these programs, like they've been doing it for 80 some odd years. And it's great, beautiful work, but it has its limitations, right? So this is where I get excited about the market mechanism here is, sure, can we expect the CPG at the end of the line to foot the whole bill now until forever? Absolutely not. But now if you start to connect the dots here, you can say, okay, we need that extra transition boost financing. That's a great role for government to play, sort of that first loss capital, that de-risking financing. It's the whole purpose of most government programs, de-risking farm and food production, right? So de-risk that first 3 years with that extra boost incentive. keep those practices in place with the ongoing market incentive from maybe that downstream buyer of your commodity. And then what I think it's really exciting is moving away from thinking about this as carbon credits, we only have a single beneficiary. We think about this as data that goes across the production system. You get the ag input companies that are trying to innovate around climate, but their motivation to innovate, it's not unlike pharmaceutical companies, that their motivation to innovate is, can I have a patented thing that I can sell with these innovations that I make? So they want to innovate towards climate, like they know this is a future, but they just want to get on more acres. So now if you're saying, I've got this downstream CPG that wants more efficient production, and I've got this upstream seed designer or, ag input designer that's trying to make it more efficient, now can we connect the dots? And these guys get to be on more acres because the farmers may select that product, all else held equal. It's if it's getting them to a better, lower footprint, that then they're getting incentivized for with the downstream. So now this is where you start to get to the power of collective investment and collaborative, mutually beneficial action. So that's I think the unlock that we're working on. And we're, a little company that just has a quantification piece. So we can't make all those things come together, but what we can do is create that kind of digital infrastructure that provides a data layer around which this value can be created and shared. And that's what gets me excited about it. Like, we're never going to get there with buying carbon credits, just to be blunt. Like, that's kind of beyond debate. They're a great tool. It's a yes and with all of this stuff, as you guys see in climate, right? It's a yes and everything. Like, yeah, we need everybody, and let's not debate perfect over the good, but some things do work better than others. And that market mechanism aligning incentives across the chain, I think, is a really exciting future for ag.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a hideously complex space. All that being said, though, you started to dive into HabiTerre's tech. So if you could give us like a kindergarten level explanation, what is HabiTerre's technology? How does it help farmers?
Maybe you're asking me to do what I think is maybe the single most challenging thing of my job.
Take as many takes as you need.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking, decades of research, hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific papers, and numerous pieces of thoughtfully, deeply integrated, very advanced technology, knowledge-guided machine learning, and, AI and all that fun stuff all plays a role, satellite imagery, just heavy computational stuff. But to distill that all down to what actually matters here, to estimate the environmental outcomes related to agriculture, like, we already kind of established there's a market opportunity and there's value for being able to quantify, measure, describe those outcomes, and you can create valuable transactions around the ability to do that. The more accurate you are, the more valuable those transactions can be, because if you can reduce that uncertainty as to how real was this outcome, then it's easier to justify, more spend for that particular outcome relative to other options that are out there. So there's a really important component of like quantifying it well. But the other piece of scaling here is it's a data scarce environment. Like, farmers, don't necessarily want to sit down at a computer and put in 100 data points into this really esoteric, ecosystem model. So that's the key solve for us, is incredibly deep science and technology made as lean, scalable, and efficient as possible without sacrificing the scientific rigor, I think, is the key takeaway. So the whole idea here, to put that in simple terms, is today when a farmer is asked to sign up for a carbon program in a traditional sense, you can quantify the outcomes in a lot of different ways. You can spend a bunch of money on soil sampling, and you can spend a bunch of money on going out and putting somebody across the table from a farmer and sitting down and collecting all this data for years and tons of lines of data. And then kind of technically anybody can really do that without super deep technology. But you can see, like, if we're saying that there aren't enough dollars to go around to even influence the change, then there certainly aren't enough dollars to go around to spend all the money that costs to measure and gather data that way. So this is where we play that role, is we need high confidence numbers to be able to create meaningful markets around them. And we need to be able to do that doesn't involve requesting unreasonable amounts of data from farmers or spending a bunch of money traipsing around and trying to measure this stuff that is vanishingly hard to measure accurately. So what we do is quantify it in a way that requires as little data as possible, but is deeply backed by, decades of research and ground truth validation. So that's kind of the core of it. And how it benefits farmers, this is always a tricky one too, right? It's also like we're dealing in an intangible good, and it's hard to even make like what we do tangible, let alone to a farmer. So really what it boils down to is if we're doing our job right, like farmers see these programs everywhere, they're interested in them. There's a proliferation of them. They don't make much sense. They don't invest enough. They're requiring too much data, all that. But based on what I described, you can see that like if we're doing our job right, we're not another screen in front of a farmer, and we don't want to be. They don't need that. They've got enough screens. Like one of our key investors, John Deere, right? Like it's one of the best screens out there as far as farm management software. They're on 400 million plus acres with engaged farmers. We don't need to be another screen in front of them, and that's not what the farmers need. So we are that back end technology that says, okay, if we can streamline this engagement, create greater confidence in the buyers that are paying for farmer enrollment, paying for these activities, by doing that, then the farmer experience is better. More of the share of the dollar spent goes to the farmer rather than measurement and quantification. So more of the incentive goes there, you get more engagement. So it becomes this flywheel that now we can do some sense making of the market. And our goal is to be that market standard sort of back end infrastructure that says, yeah, compete on program design, compete on how you talk to farmers, sign them up, compete on what you pay them. But let's not keep making such a mess of competing on, are you collecting 90 data points or 100? Let's actually make a market that can work for all of them. And that's where we can be kind of agnostic in it. So I know it's a really long answer, but it's like, yeah, if I'm talking to my brother on the farm, hey, Nick, how do you benefit me? I'm like, I don't know. You want to sign up for one of these sustainability programs? No? Cool. Then I probably don't. But if you want a supplemental income that isn't a lot of work for you and it aligns with what you want to do managing the farm anyway, we benefit you. You're just probably not going to see the HabiTerre logo on your screen, but we're behind it.
That's actually a really helpful explanation. So you've gone through the process of explaining how the market itself functions and where all the incentives lie. And it sounds like, and if I'm understanding this correctly, you plug in by making sure that the data that they're working with to communicate the value of what they're producing is very clear and very transparent for everybody else in the market, right?
Yeah.
And then you make the user experience on their end as smooth as possible, so it's not a ton of extra work for them to deliver that clarity and that value to the market.
Yep, you got it. It's a
Okay.
nice ways. Yeah. And one small layer, we talk a lot about tech and design and uncertainty and all this scientific or product tech stuff. The reality for a lot of our like big corporate customers that work with us, like the big sentiment is, we trust you guys and you get it and you're here to make my life easier and I appreciate that. So a lot of it is just like being real humans who understand this stuff, who are serious about it, and we mean what we say and we say what we mean, and then we execute, and that's like that gets lost in the marketing nonsense that gets thrown around, but that's a huge part of it too. Is just it's messy, it's nascent, it's fast moving, and the more that we can help our partners make sense of it, the better it gets for everybody, on top of all the things that we do technologically.
Yeah, it's amazing how often when we talk to people in their different domains where they're trying to make a positive climate impact, how complex and interwoven the markets are and the systems of incentives are. And even very well-intentioned people have a hard time doing things in a way that creates wins across the board, that doesn't, basically put an undue cost burden on them as the user or as the producer or what have you. So it's amazing how much of it comes down to, can you produce the value and can you actually make my life easier in the process? I want to do this. I want to make a positive contribution, but it's so hard.
Yeah, that is spot on. And people ask a lot, like lately, we'll steer very clear of politics, but we'll just say recently it's not a super favorable environment for climate impact in the United States. So, people are saying like, well, is this market going away? Like, are people getting investments? What I'm observing, tied exactly to what you just described, is it's an inertia problem, not an intent or appetite problem, right? So nobody's walking away. Like all these corporates, all the people in the sustainability roles, all the people in the impact space, like everybody still wants to do it. They want to do the right thing, but the inertia results from like, I don't know how to make sense of what's out there. I don't know what's right for me. I don't know the right way to invest. So until that becomes clear, easy to understand, I just got to kind of sit on it because that's safer than spending money on something that I don't know how it's going to work or if it's going to work. So that's where I think we can really improve things. Is it's not like has the direction of the market gone away? Soft, maybe slightly because of the overall, but the overwhelming direction is people want to invest in this stuff, and it's harder than necessary for them to do so because it's more confusing than it maybe has to be.
You've talked a lot about some of the complexities in the market. I'm wondering, Nick, if you'd be willing to dive into what are some of the challenges that you've run into from an organizational development perspective as you're trying to carve out this space in the market?
Yeah. You got another couple hours? So I I've had the most fun of my entire life the last 3 years or so, give or take, that I've been at HabiTerre. Just, I love that phrase, like, if you're the smartest guy in the room, you're in the wrong room. I cannot remember the last time I was the smartest guy in a room with any of my colleagues. So that's a truly beautiful thing. And one of the biggest learnings, challenges, this is internal to HabiTerre, but also sort of emblematic of the space that we're in, is, we were a company founded by a brilliant world-leading scientist in agroecological modeling, Dr. Kai Guan at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And can't say enough. Like, the guy is brilliant and compelling, and I don't know when he sleeps. And through that genesis and that influence, we grew up over the last few years as a very, very scientifically rigorous, science, technology, do it right and validate it sort of organization. And one thing we've talked about recently as a team is, most startups, they create this thing called tech debt, which is you go out there and you sell the heck out of a thing and then hope you can build it before people figure out that what you sold them you haven't actually really built yet, right? Like, that's typical startup game in technology. And our version of tech debt is actually like kind of marketing and product marketing debt, of like just contextualizing the power and value of what we do. So we really overbuilt, in a good way, the technology, the tech stack, the technical rigor and acumen. But now the shift for us is calibrating to, how do we make this easier for our customers to understand, easier for our customers to use, and translate what we know is important into what actually creates value for them, because the two things are often related but almost never the same, right? And like, that, I think, is really a key learning that can be really hard for especially extremely technical folks. Like, no, this matters because it matters. Read my research. It's like, nobody reads that. But if we can communicate that in the terms that somebody that's going to see 2 slides in a slide deck from their sustainability lead at the corporate level that's making the financial decisions, we can say, this is why we're working with HabiTerre, and here's the value it creates. And it's going to have nothing to do with really heavy analysis. It's going to have everything to do with, am I comfortable with what they're delivering? Do I believe that they're the best partner that's going to help me not get sued if I'm claiming benefits from these things? Like, do I trust what's behind this? So that's a big thing for us, is like translating that and kind of getting out of our own blinders regarding what matters, and being able to really just simplify the message and make it easier to understand and work with. And I say that's kind of emblematic of the industry as a whole. I think that's where so many you talked about well-intentioned people earlier, like so many super well-intentioned people who have been, sort of on the vanguard of like designing climate policy and climate procedures and accounting rules and guidelines and all that. Best intentions of the world, but they've gone so far down this path of perfect becoming the enemy of the good, or everybody gets axle wrapped in debating the how rather than just focusing on, are we going in the right direction or not? The how is going to be imperfect. The rules are going to be imperfect, but it's not a reason to not take action. And I think, kind of, like I said, we're going to be in some ways representative of and influenced by the system in which we operate and exist. And it's mutually reinforcing. The companies that work in it are maybe too technical for their own good sometimes. And the system as a whole can be too technical for its own good, where coming back to simple language can be really powerful. And I see that being true well outside of our sector in everything to do with climate impact. We end up just talking right past the things that matter to most people, I think.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, has that been your role, stepping in as a leader, to be the translator and to figure out how to do that?
Yes, and that's probably why I've felt so at home in this role. I grew up on a farm in North Dakota, middle of nowhere, and I was a huge nerd from day one. So like reading books, traveling, all that stuff. And I always felt like kind of an alien in my home planet. So I became a really, really good translator. And talked to my dad in farm terms, and I did 10 years in ag banking and crop insurance. So at the same time that I'm reading like heavy philosophy and psychology and all that, and government policy and things around climate change and the science of soil health, I'm also communicating with local farmers who think I'm, you know, nuts at worst and kind of weird at best. But at least like being able to translate these things
Sure.
is
Yeah.
superpower, right? And like I'm working on it all
Hmm.
the time. But yeah, just translating to simple language is such a critical part. And I think, you know, anybody that feels like they are out of place because they're not a domain expert, please be working in climate. Like we need those people to translate it into plain language and to just sit in the struggle with it to say, okay, I understand the technical value of that. I don't even know how to turn that into plain language, but I'm going to sit with it and be uncomfortable in about a dozen conversations until I hit the thing that clicks for me, for the audience, whatever. So yeah, but over translating, so you're getting long answers from me on everything. Short answer, yes. Translation is a key part of this role.
No, that's all right. We love your translating ability here. So, and maybe this is the hardest translation question I've given you yet, but I wonder if it's possible for you to explain one of those moments where you figured out how to have that conversation, or tell us a story where you're talking to a client and you figured out the way to bridge that gap between the technology and their needs and their perspective.
Yeah, a few different examples. I'm gonna go back to my favorite one. It's maybe not the best example, but my favorite one probably is one of the first things I got to do in this space was put together a transaction with. It was really one of the first big events for me as I shifted in a sustainability space from kind of my ag roots in North Dakota. So this was in my role prior to HabiTerre when I was working at Truterra Sustainability Business at Land O'Lakes. And I was so excited. We had just closed this deal with Microsoft. And short and sweet, Microsoft, through us, was paying farmers to store carbon in the soil on behalf of Microsoft, right? So I called up my grandpa, who was still around at that time, and this guy's seen like he raised Clydesdales and you know used them on the farm to like he didn't ever really retire until he couldn't sit in the tractor anymore. And even then, he's programming A/B lines in a GPS system in a tractor that steers itself, right? Like this guy's seen a lot.
Yeah.
And I just called Grandpa up and I said, "Hey, we just get this really cool deal." And he's like, "What does a computer company have to do with farming?" I'm like, "That's a perfectly reasonable question, Grandpa." Um, and it's
Yeah.
like, so, you know, they're dealing in energy and, you know, metals and chips and things like that. And it's like, it's going to be very hard for them to take their environmental impact to zero with the nature of the business that they do. So, the beauty of agriculture and an opportunity for the future of ag is there's companies like that that want to be doing the right thing for the planet, but they don't really have that many great ways to do that within their buildings, their factories, things like that. So what they can do is pay farmers like you to take good action on their behalf, and luckily that action also happens to be good for your farm, right? So like look at the farm there. You used to take 3-4 tillage passes a year. Just by the nature of knowing that it's better for your system, you're down to 0 to 1 tillage passes a year. And now we've got these companies that'll pay you to do that thing that's already good for you on the farm because that's also good for them, their position or image. And he goes, "Huh, well, try and explain that to your dad." It's probably a bad example. It just says it's a good translation example. And he's still like, I'm over it. But I felt like we
Well,
got close there at least. Yeah.
was Grandpa at least satisfied with that answer?
uh, he was right up until he said, so like, how do I put more carbon in the soil? And I said, you know, things like no-till cover crops. And he's like, "Nick, this is North Dakota. We don't get enough time to raise one crop, and you want me to raise another one that doesn't pay? No." And so that
And
was
then
the
he
other
hung up on you?
then we changed the subject. Yeah. Um, but no, and like that, I guess full circle back to like carbon credit markets. Like they just want to pay for a very specified, they call it an intervention. So that plays really well with farmers, right? Hey, you need an intervention for the way that you're farming that you've been doing for multiple generations. So there we have a translation problem right out of the gate. But
Mhm.
it's these really prescriptive practice changes like cover crop or tillage or whatever, and you just get this very short pick list that you can create a claim off of. And that's where I say I'm so excited about the future that we're looking at, because we look at every aspect of the system, above ground, below ground. How productive was that crop? Where did the nutrients go? Where did the water go? What happened with the soil? What happened with the soil microbial community underground? Did that nutrient, go away to a waterway? Whatever. You put that collective impact together, and now you say, we don't have to be so prescriptive. So that, like, if my grandpa was still around, I'd call him and go, okay, it's making way more sense now. You know how you hate your fertilizer bill? Well, guess what? You can actually get incentivized to be more efficient with that fertilizer, or use that extra product that makes more of your fertilizer go into the plant than into the air and waterways. And if that was a wash for you in the past, now that's actually more profitable to do the thing that is more efficient. So now we can start to capture that systems impact. And now we don't have to tell a North Dakota farmer to do a thing that's not feasible on their farm because it's the only tool that we have available. Now we can say, hey, we can measure the outcome of what you're doing, and we can give you an indication like, hey, here's some things that you're thinking about changing, and those happen to have a climate or environmental benefit, and we can create incentives around that without having to prescribe exactly what's right for you on your farm, because we're always going to get that right. And you're going to get that right because you know your farm and what's going to work for you. I guess I'm translating in a different way.
That was a good translation right
wish I
there.
could. Yeah.
Yeah.
Grandpa would have gotten that one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, now you should call him again after this and try that one on him.
Right.
Yeah, that's again, the complexity of this is amazing, and you've talked a lot about just moving in the right direction. Are we going in the right direction, traveling in that space directionally, collectively? And again, without getting too deep into the politics around it, the identity politics, whether we're talking, blue red, or whether we're talking about farming, or whether we're talking about the grid, or whether we're talking about whatever, is a really important conversation to have, because we need to be able to have the conversation in order to come up with solutions and then implement them and adopt them. So thanks for doing some of this translation for us today. Hopefully we can have a part two. I mean, selfishly, it's a joy and a pleasure to call you my friend, and an honor, but hopefully we can do a part two, because there's just so many other things that I would love to double click on that I think would be really helpful, just in terms of, helping people understand the context of the decisions that they're making and how those decisions are impacting climate when it comes to ag. But in the spirit of wrapping up, we always like to end with two questions. So first one, kind of high level, what is one system level change that would help move the sustainable agriculture movement forward?
Yeah. Consistency across programs would be the big one. So everybody's waiting for standards bodies like Science-Based Targets Initiative and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to come out with the universal guideline that everybody can align around. The hard, unfortunate truth is there's still a huge gap between those and on-the-ground realities. So some parts of them are overly prescriptive to the point of being unworkable, and then other parts are too vague to be useful. So my hope is that we can at least align around, like, here's kind of a source of truth of, like, what is the impact, what's the nature of what we're trying to measure, and what are directionally appropriate ways to measure that, and stop wasting so much time and energy on debating the perfect way to account for these things. And let's just say, like, this is a good enough way to account for these things, and now let's build some systems for action around them, and then focus on continuous improvement rather than trying to get it right before we even really move.
Yeah, you hear sentiments like that in a lot of sectors, but that makes a lot of sense. And what would you say is one thing individual consumers could do to have if they're interested in having an impact on the carbon footprint of farming?
Yeah. One thing wrapped up together, it's maybe two things. That's my excuse to call two things one thing, is focus on your biggest impact being how you vote with your dollar. So consumers get worried about, am I taking too long of a shower? What am I doing for power and whatever? 80 to 90% of clean water usage, energy usage, and emissions are coming from the commercial sphere, not consumers. So we could have every individual do the right thing in their house, and it ain't going to matter. So the signal you need to send is to be as informed as you can as a consumer, to buy products from companies that are signaling meaningfully their intent and their action on climate and sustainability. And you can just kind of, like, there's a look and feel to it, but that's the other place that we play a role, is like getting more of that data further downstream to make that decision easier. But if you want to have an impact, don't focus on all the little stuff you can do in your house. Like, you drive your electric car, that's great, and that makes a difference, but vote with your dollar. Yeah.
It's good to hear that from your mouth, Nick. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and it's a little bit self-interested because I don't really, I like riding a jet ski or driving a boat or something like that.
No, those are the reality checks that we need, though. That's good stuff.
Yeah, right? Like, we're not going to get people to do things that they don't like. So they're still going to eat meat, they're still going to drive a car. But vote with your dollar. That makes a way bigger impact than any other type of individual choice.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Nick Reinke, thanks for being on The Turning Point.
Thank you, guys. Pleasure. And I'd be happy to come back again.
Big thanks to Nick Reinke for being our guest today. You can learn more about HabiTerre and their technology at HabiTerre.com. Also, thanks to you for listening and for doing the work that you do to make an impact. At Still Point Insight, we specialize in helping mission-driven orgs like yours amplify their impact through organizational development consulting. You can check us out at stillpointinsight.com.